All right, hello everybody. We returned for the second of three total lectures about the human history of Antarctica. And this particular lecture is not cleanly divided into two halves. The material in both halves focuses on the heroic age of Antarctic exploration and the events leading up to it, and a bit of the immediate aftermath. And many of the most famous Antarctic figures are from this era, like Shackleton, Amundsen, and Scott. And a total of 17 expeditions took place during this period, which is really defined more than anything by the actual intense focus on Antarctic exploration and scientific research for their own sake, as well as the large number of expeditions launched during a relatively short window of time. So we'll start by exploring some factors that led to Antarctic exploration to speed up, and then we'll delve into the specifics of a number of the expeditions. I don't cover all 17 expeditions in detail, but I allude to all of them at least once, and I spend longer on some of the more famous and fascinating stories. And we go from this lecture to people not ever having set foot in Antarctica to, by the end of the period covered, almost all of Antarctica is, the outside of Antarctica at least, is mapped, and its physical extent is known, and people have spent much, much more time on it. But the age of human bases and increased scientific research there is something we'll focus on more for the next lecture. And I really do want to apologize for the lateness in getting this lecture up. I have had some things going on in my personal life, as well as I also have two other jobs. And I just kind of became completely swamped with work and had a hard time getting this together. This lecture also needed quite a bit of work from the last time I taught this, and I think it may have required more work on my end because I find history very fascinating, if kind of sordid much of the time, but I'm a geologist by trade, not a historian, so I think it took me a little bit longer to get some of this up to par. But including this week and dead week, there are 3 remaining weeks in the quarter. So this is the third to last week, and next week we cover climate change, and then dead week is after that, and I will not be teaching you any new material during dead week. And then you have finals week. And during finals week, the only thing you'll have left to do is take the final exam. So remember that quiz number 2 is due on Friday, February 26th, and that there's a lab due that same day, the Antarctic Exploration Lab, and it doesn't require any direct knowledge of the history-related lecture material. But it may be worth reviewing the maps lab as well as the geography lectures from earlier in the term. Also, reading assignment number 2 is due at the end of dead week. So dead week is potentially a good time to work on that if you don't get to it by that point. And there's also another colloquium happening in our department, Thursday, February 25th at 2:00 p.m. And so the Zoom link is here, as well as in another email that I sent out. There is only one more lab after this week, and there is no lab whatsoever during dead week. So I recommend emailing your TAs ASAP with any remaining concerns or questions you have about labs or your lab grades, and please do that before finals week. That's what I'm the start of finals week is what I'm treating as the goal to get questions. If you have questions about assignments or quizzes to me, or if you have questions about labs for your TAs, or if you're looking to submit extra credits, try to get them done before finals week. So this lecture actually covers a much more concentrated window of time than the previous one. So only about 23 years compared to several centuries, as well as an allusion to millennia of the emptiness of Antarctica before humans even got anywhere near it. And so Antarctic exploration really sped up at the end of the 19th century, and a large number of expeditions to the continent occurred in a very short window of time. And this period between 1897 and 1922 is known as the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Let me just find a better place for that. Man, I didn't leave myself a good place for me here. Anyway, these expeditions were motivated much more explicitly by an interest in map-making, scientific discoveries, and in some cases, simple adventure and glory than many of the previous expeditions we learned about. And that's one reason that it's referred to as the heroic age. Another reason is the boldness and ambition of some of the explorers' plans, like an attempt to reach the South Pole, or Shackleton's goal of crossing the entire continent, which he did not accomplish. He ended up being stranded, and his story ended up being a rescue story rather than an adventure story, really. But on that note, the hardships that some of the people faced play into the mythos and are one reason why it's known as the heroic age, as well as the stories of survival and resilience that came out of some of these trips. And of course, imperialistic and political factors don't ever completely disappear. The vast majority, all of the expeditions were funded by the governments of, or were hosted by countries that you would consider imperial powers. And one aspect of the exploration was potentially for these countries to have a chance to control parts of the Antarctic. And down the line, we'll talk about how the Antarctic Treaty was to some extent enacted so that countries couldn't really claim and enforce their claims to Antarctica. So in this lecture, we see the first people land in Antarctica, and then increasingly ambitious goals like overwintering, reaching the South Pole, which many of them explicitly were down there with that goal. And by the end of this period, Antarctica goes from being a continent that humans have literally never set foot on to one that humans have explored greatly, if not to the extent that exploration or long-term habitation is actually safe. By the way, this is Shackleton's cat. It actually was not, he actually was not owned by Shackleton. He was a male cat brought on board the most famous expedition by Master Shipwright Harry Chippy McNish. So he was named Mrs. Chippy. This is another guy. This is Pierce Blackborough, who was a stowaway, and he actually survived the trip, but he was the one who had to have his toes amputated while the men were trapped on Elephant Island, waiting for Shackleton to come back. So anyway, Mrs. Chippy was a male cat. He was referred to as Mrs. Chippy because they thought he was a girl cat at first, and he followed the carpenter around like an obedient wife was supposed to in Victorian times. And the name stuck even after they realized it was a male cat. Unfortunately, Mrs. Chippy did not survive. Shackleton, when they had to abandon the ship, Shackleton ordered that Mrs. Chippy and a couple of the dogs that were not doing as well be put down. And apparently, Mr. Chippy never forgave Shackleton for that. So all of the people survived Shackleton's voyage, but the cat did not, which makes me kind of sad, just because I'm a cat lady. Anyway, it's kind of just a funny footnote because pets are no longer allowed on Antarctic research bases. So she's one of the few, she was a mousing cat as well, but she's one of the few cats/pets to visit Antarctica. So one interesting aspect of this is that the California gold rush has a lot to do with the increase in attention towards Antarctica. In 1849, gold was first discovered in California, and Americans began flocking to settle there and also displacing indigenous Californians in the process. And many people immigrated to work in the mines or to build infrastructure like work on the railroads or work in the towns that were starting to turn into actual cities with the advent of gold, like San Francisco. San Francisco was the gold rush port, and it was where most of these people were heading. So some of the people who were already living in the US came overland, but and some came straight across the Pacific Ocean, like the immigrants from China and elsewhere in East Asia. But a lot of people came by boat, and a lot of the people who were coming from Europe came by boat around Cape Horn or through the Straits of Magellan. Usually the Straits of Magellan, because south of Cape Horn is the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and it's stormy. The Panama Canal had not yet been built, and nobody had really found a Northwest Passage that anybody besides really grizzled Arctic explorers would want to go through. So people went through the Straits of Magellan, and there was already a sizable population of people living in the Falklands and in the other sub-Antarctic islands because of the whaling and sealing stations. But the Falklands became a lot more important as a ship repair and resupply point, as did some of the other whaling and sealing settlements farther south. And so with more people passing by the Straits, including a lot of wealthy and influential people on their way to San Francisco, interest in Antarctica and what might exist there began to spread. And there were also simply more people now in the Southern Ocean. So remember that James Clark Ross's expedition was a little bit before this. It ended in 1842. And there were very few visits to Antarctica in the meantime until we start talking about our first people here. But more people began to take notice in Antarctica, and that began to change. And an important step occurred in the 1890s when we have our first documented landing in Antarctica. A Norwegian man named Henrik Bull who was actually searching for a species of whale that is now known to be the southern right whale, one of the larger baleen whales. He made a voyage south into the Ross Sea, which had not been visited since Ross himself had gone there, and kind of claimed, I don't think there's much more to see here, which is not accurate, but and he landed on Possession Island, the Possession Islands, which are right off the coast of the mainland on the Ross Sea, and he is thus often considered the first person to have definitively set foot in Antarctica. Some people think that whalers might have done so in the peninsula earlier, but but their accounts are not as well documented, in part because they did not keep as detailed scientific notes always. Bull actually became the first person to document life in the Antarctica either way, though. He found lichens, which were actually some of the only life that I saw while I was there. And so he became the first person to note that Antarctica had any terrestrial ecology whatsoever. And so 1897 is considered the start of the heroic age because it's the year in which the first of the expeditions occurred, the Belgian Antarctic Expedition, in which the crew became the first to overwinter on the continent. And the age is considered to have ended after Shackleton's third and final expedition, by which point a lot more of the continent was known, and the world was in the tense period between the two world wars. The expeditions were much more distinctly scientific and fact-finding in nature. The British interest in Antarctica in particular had been renewed by a speech given to the Royal Geographic Society of London by a certain John Murray, in which he urged the scientists to explore because we should just not leave anything unexplored, which, considering the British Empire, feels like a very British thing to say. But even though Ross and others had said it's an icy wasteland, people bought into the idea that there might be more worth exploring in that icy wasteland, not wasteland. I love Antarctica. So the term heroic would be bestowed later. It's not something that these people referred to themselves as. That would be a little bit egotistical, honestly. And it was bestowed later in reference to the increased focus on exploration, the ambition, the hardships, and the accounts of sacrifice, danger, and bravery that would come out of many of these accounts, and that would make them popular adventure stories in many ways, as much as they were historical accounts. And Antarctic research would fall on the back burner a bit on the period leading up to World War II, just because the world had gone through the Great War and was in the tense period leading up to the Second World War and the Holocaust and everything associated with it. But in the aftermath of World War II, when Antarctic research became sort of a point of, okay, let's show that we can collaborate as nations. Let's do this peacefully. Antarctica became the focus of renewed attention again, and many of the findings and maps from the heroic age were then revisited and used as the basis for some of the first concentrated scientific research on Antarctica, conducted during the International Geophysical Year. And that's something we'll talk about more in the next lecture. So the first expedition now considered to be part of the heroic age was the Belgian Antarctic expedition fronted by Adrien Vijay de Gerlache. And Belgium, if you've ever taken an African history or a European history class, was actually a huge colonial empire in the 19th century. It had the resources from its occupation of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo to fund large-scale scientific expeditions. So Gerlache actually went to Antarctica with Roald Amundsen as his first mate, and Amundsen will come up later as the first man as the leader of the first crew to reach the South Pole. So Gerlache headed to the peninsula and undertook what would become the first of many sledge journeys on the continent. And sledges, often pulled by dogs, were the main way in which people traveled across Antarctica during much of this period. They would test out other methods, which we'll talk about, but sledges or being on foot was mostly how people worked. So they took a sledge journey that lasted about a week on an island near the peninsula. It's actually this one marked in red here. And his crew became the first to overwinter south of the Antarctic Circle. So remember that Captain Cook had crossed the Antarctic Circle before, but had overwintered in New Zealand, and other people had followed suit. But Gerlache and his crew spent winter south of their. They basically got stuck. Actually, they got stuck and had to eat penguins. And I find Mr. Gerlache's description of penguin meat kind of amusing, and it also makes me happy to think that people might not really want to eat penguins that much, because their populations need to be protected because their environment is getting increasingly fragile with global warming. But they spent long enough south of the circle to experience the midnight sun as well. Remember that the Antarctic Circle is defined as the latitude below which land will experience at least one 24-hour period of continuous daylight per year, as well as at least one continuous period of darkness. And so they had to eat penguin, and I also kind of feel like his journal is a weird creative outlet. I feel like there's some interesting stories about how people flexed their creativity and tried to occupy their minds with things to not lose their sanity during all of this. They had to cut their ship out by hand, and it took them about a month to do that. They they got lucky and were able to carve a wide enough channel because they were actually, the ship was stuck in there for a winter and then remained stuck during the summer when they saw the midnight sun, and they were facing the possibility of getting stuck there for yet another Antarctic winter, and they managed to cut themselves out, luckily. But only one person died on the trip, which was pretty good, and they obtained a number of important meteorological observations that would do a lot towards improving understanding of the Antarctic climate. They also came back with more lichen samples, which proved really useful for mycologists, people who study mushrooms. So, not too shabby, all things considered. One of the relatively few expeditions to be privately funded was the Southern Cross Expedition. It was also known as the Borchgrevink Expedition, after Karsten E. Borchgrevink, who was the group's Norwegian-born Australian captain. And the Southern Cross is named after the ship they went on. You'll see these trips referred to variously after the ships they went on and the people. I try to allude to both on each slide, at least so that you can look them up. But again, don't memorize these dates. These are in here as reference and to help you keep track of them, but I'm not going to ask you, when was the Southern Cross Expedition? Because that's not a good use of our time, I feel. In any case, Borchgrevink was experienced from Arctic exploration, and he was largely the brains of the operation. So they actually became the first crew to overwinter on the mainland. They overwintered at Cape Adair, which is here. It's north of where I was. Where is it? Here's Ross Island and southern Victoria Land. And then if you head north, I realize it's to the bottom, but the South Pole is over here. In northern Victoria Land, at the sort of northernmost tip of Victoria Land, is Cape Adair, which is where the Borchgrevink expedition overwintered. And during their stay, they discovered that Antarctica had some insects. So they became the first people to document land animals. And they also recorded some of the first observations of Adelie penguins. And this is their hut, actually. Their hut is located near an Adelie penguin colony, and it still stands to this day because the Antarctic cold really inhibits rotting. So wooden structures just don't rot. And so a lot of the structures left behind by these heroic age explorers are actually still there, and I've visited one of them, which I'll talk about, which I think is cool. I didn't take any of these pictures, but I do have a couple of pictures of Scott's hut later. In any case, they actually were the first to visit the Ross Sea in depth. They were the first British expedition to visit the Ross Sea in depth since Ross himself had gone. And they discovered that the Ross ice shelf, which was then often known as the Great Ice Barrier because of how dangerous it was, it had actually retreated, which possibly might be a consequence of early industrial age emissions, but who knows? It's complicated. But in any case, they also reached a new farthest south record while they were venturing in the Ross Sea, but they almost had a disaster. They almost burned their hut down with a fire. Fires in Antarctica can blow out of control, and the fire was literally from a candle, and they almost lost their scant shelter because of a candle fire that was whipped out of control by the wind. And to this very day, fires in Antarctica are a big fear because it is the windiest continent on Earth, and wind just whips the fires up. There is still a fire department at McMurdo Base, and in 1978, there was a huge fire at McMurdo that actually destroyed a bunch of structures, including the chapel that they had originally built there. So fire in Antarctica is not a joke, surprisingly. I met a man who was working for the fire department there who actually, on the off season, worked as a helicopter firefighter for Channel Islands National Park near Santa Barbara. So it was kind of a funny coincidence. Now, speaking of Scott, he went to Antarctica several times, actually. And this is about his first voyage. And I did take this picture. This is Scott's hut, which is close to McMurdo and within walking distance of it. So Robert Falcon Scott would later become one of the men involved in the legendary race to the South Pole. And he's one of the heroic figures you've heard of. You've probably also seen the name Scott if you've looked in detail at a map of Antarctica, because there's Scott Peninsula, Amundsen Scott Base, not to be confused with the New Zealand Scott Base next to McMurdo. There's Scott Base and Amundsen Scott South Pole Base, which are very different things. But those features are all named after him. And well before the race to the South Pole, he visited Antarctica as part of a government-funded British expedition. And this was the first government-funded expedition to Antarctica by the UK since the Ross Expedition. Remember that the Southern Cross Expedition had been private. So Scott landed near the present location of McMurdo Base on Ross Island, and his hut from his stay is still visible and within walking distance of McMurdo. You can't go in it, but you can see just how well it's been preserved. And he attempted a trip to the South Pole, actually. He that was one of his big goals from the start. And he used sledges pulled by dogs and managed to beat the farthest south record set by Borchgrevink. But he soon realized that he had made a lot of mistakes with planning the dogs' food and had to kill more of them than he'd planned. And his men started to suffer from snow blindness and frostbite and scurvy, the lack of vitamin C. And so he was forced to turn back. So he was quite depressed about this and would obviously subsequently plan a trip that was set aside only for the goal of reaching the South Pole. And Shackleton actually, funnily enough, came to Antarctica during this expedition. He came on as Scott's third officer, and he partook in the attempt to reach the South Pole, but he ended up having to be carried out at the end because he was so weak from scurvy. And he had to leave early when a relief ship took some of the men back. Some accounts indicate that this is when they started disliking each other. Others differ on that and said they were pretty cordial, but eventually down the line, Shackleton and Scott ended up feeling kind of peeved at each other for various reasons. It's been a little blown out of proportion by the accounts, but it's become a central point of the mythos of Antarctic exploration. And so the expedition actually traveled with relatively few scientists and was many ways kind of an adventure exploration to start, but they did have some important findings. The geologist they had with them was Farrar, who, if you remember, is the Farrar basalts are the lava flows from the volcanism from when Pangaea broke up. And so those are named after him, actually, and so is a glacier in the same area. So those basalts are exposed in the dry valleys where I was, and that's Scott during his first visit was actually the first person to spot them. Scott had to overwinter twice, and he decided to use the extra time in Antarctica to make another venture inland. And he initially attempted to reach the South Geomagnetic Pole, but they instead went up the glacier that would later bear the geologist's name, Farrar Glacier, and they became the first crew to reach the polar plateau. And the polar plateau is a term for the East Antarctic ice sheet, for the unbroken ice that you get once you climb past the Transantarctic Mountains and get more inland. And so they traveled for about a week on there before deciding to head back because they were lost and because there's very few landmarks there. And Scott himself survived a potentially fatal fall into a crevasse. So crevasses, those cracks in the glaciers, have been dangerous for people as long as people have been going to Antarctica. And remember that he was doing so with no maps or satellite monitoring of where they are. So it was even more dangerous for him. The Transantarctic Mountains, speaking of which, had been first noted by Ross, and Scott discovered that they went inland. So that renewed interest among geologists as to, okay, there are apparently some interesting geologic features inland and maybe minerals as well. Spoiler, there are, but they are now forbidden from being extracted. And they also observed emperor penguins breeding, and this is a sketch actually from one of their members, Edward Wilson. So the colony that they observed on Ross Island is still there. There are multiple emperor penguin colonies on Ross Island, and they spent quite a while observing and sketching those, which is pretty cool. And they also mapped the eastern edge, which is now known as Edward VII Land, the eastern edge of the Ross Sea, I might add. And so this solidified the geographic understanding of the shape of the Ross Sea, and that would later assist other explorers in more firmly starting a base there. And also, the Ross Sea is now kind of a human hub of Antarctica. It's where the largest base, McMurdo, is, and where a lot of the traffic comes into Antarctica. So it's been, the Ross Sea area has been kind of a hub of human interaction for a long time. So there's his ship trapped in the ice. There's his men hanging around. This shows his various trips. This shows him going up to the polar plateau. This shows him exploring the Ross Island and looking for penguin colonies. And this is the hut that they used to protect themselves, still visible and quite well preserved to this very day. I think some of the props are kind of in there as props, like some of the food, but the structure and most of the stove and most of the stuff is from when Scott was there. And Black Island, actually, which is here, is home to the satellite dish that links the extremely weak and hard to use internet from the rest of the world and beams it to McMurdo. So Black Island, so it's just kind of a fun little tidbit from when I was there. This little island is Antarctica's, or at least for McMurdo, it's McMurdo's main connection to the outside world. Moving on to the next expedition. So we'll come back to Scott later. The next expedition we'll talk about was the Gauss Expedition, headed by Erich D. von Drygalski, and it was the first German Antarctic expedition. And Germany had only existed as a unified nation since 1871, actually. It was seeking to establish itself on equal footing with the UK and France and other international powers. And so the expedition headed to an island called Kerguelen, which is one of the larger subantarctic islands. It's in the southern Indian Ocean, and it's now controlled by France, but inhabited only by a small scientific crew. So he left a small crew there and then headed south to Antarctica, visiting Heard Island, which is a small Australian subantarctic island, and landed in East Antarctica in what he would call Kaiser Wilhelm Land, after the Emperor of Germany. The very same Emperor of Germany who would be toppled by the First World War, in fact. Remember that this is going on in the period leading up to the Great War. They got stuck in the ice and they had to overwinter. This picture actually shows their ship stuck in the ice, and there's a story behind this picture. They eventually freed themselves by burning trash, and they managed to not burn their ship in the process. But during the entrapment, they took the first aerial photographs of Antarctica. They used a camera with a pull switch connected to a balloon and took the pictures from the balloon, and they ended up with some rather cool pictures of their ship stuck in the sea ice. And they managed to document, hey, this is what sea ice actually looks like, which was quite a novelty at the time. They appear to have actually managed quite well when they were trapped compared to some of the other groups. This is an excerpt from a history that quotes Drygalski's own journal, and at least according to his account, they managed. They actually had a band going, which I feel like is a funny little preview to Ice Stock, and it kind of reminds me of just the human. It's one reason why I had you all watch Encounters at the End of the World and Antarctica: A Year on the Ice. It's interesting to see how people manage in Antarctica, because yeah, there's the adaptation to like the conditions and finding food and everything, but people also need to play to some extent. People need to have something that gives them joy. For some people, that was the science, but it also helped to have a band on board. And they had card games, apparently had plenty of alcohol. So they had alcohol. They were much better stocked with food than Scott and Borchgrevink had been. So the overwintering appears to have been a pretty pleasant one, all things considered. Anyhow, other countries soon began to send their ships. These are a couple of the expeditions that we won't go over in much detail, but I wanted to acknowledge them to give you a sense of just what countries were sending their ships. So France had actually sponsored 2 previous trips, by the way. That's why these are the 3rd and 4th. The Dumont-D'Urville expedition from the last lecture, when they looked for the magnetic pole, had been one of them. So the Swedish expedition was to the peninsula, and it was sponsored by a geologist named Odo Nortengold. But they ran into trouble when their ship, called the Antarctic, actually, the Antarctic sank, and they were forced to spend a second winter there. And in fact, one of the 2 French expeditions was actually initially launched as a rescue attempt for these men. But the Swedish expedition members ended up being saved by the Argentine Navy, of all things. The trip ended up financially ruining the geologist Nordenskjöld, but they came back with maps of the eastern coast of the peninsula, as well as rock, bird, and plant samples that they managed to salvage from the ship, so it was not a complete disaster. The Scottish expedition is best known for successfully establishing a manned weather station in Antarctica during their stay over, which now is kind of commonplace in Antarctica. We have people monitoring the weather there to monitor the conditions for the scientists who are out there in the field. And they were the first to explore the eastern Weddell Sea. Weddell himself had failed to find land there and had assumed that the ocean just went to Antarctica, and went to the South Pole. And something we'll see in some of these expeditions is that they were chartered to see if there was water between the Weddell Sea and the Ross Sea. There is not, but they didn't know that at the time. And both of the French expeditions were led by the same guy, Jean-Baptiste Charcot, and they were largely map exercises. France would later on claim territory in Antarctica, and it still has a claim in Antarctica, as well as a number of the subantarctic islands like Kerguelen, which are part of the French Southern and Antarctic territories. Now we get to Shackleton's first expedition, not his most famous one, but a valiant attempt to reach the South Pole nonetheless. So this was aboard the Nimrod, and it's often called the Nimrod expedition for that reason. Okay, the volume is working, good. And this was chartered with the goal of reaching the South Pole. It was now reasonably certain that there was land there from the findings of the Scottish expedition in the Weddell Sea. So Shackleton apparently managed to annoy Scott by starting at Ross Island. Scott did not want other people copying his route. So he was kind of chagrined about that because Shackleton had promised him that he would not do that for whatever reason. And the effort to reach the South Pole did not quite work. The red line is Shackleton's Nimrod expedition line, and you can see that he got just to the pole. That's not a mistake there. He got literally within 100 miles of it. So that was definitely disappointing. But even with that, and even with the financial difficulties that came from this trip, because Shackleton was still relatively inexperienced in planning his own trip, a lot of successes came out. There was a side party led by Edgeworth David that successfully reached the South Magnetic Pole, and they confirmed that it was close to where Dumont d'Urville had estimated previously. And Shackleton and his crew also climbed Mount Erebus. They became the first people to look into the volcano. One of the later clips in Encounters at the End of the World shows how that can still be done and why volcanologists still go there for that reason. There's 2 volcanoes in the entire world where you can look into the crater, Erebus, and then one in Ethiopia. And it is safer to go to Antarctica because Ethiopia has had a lot of problems with civil war, which I find extremely ironic. Colonialism, man. Anyhow, they sled down. They actually sledded down Mount Erebus, which would be unthinkable today, but I find kind of wonderful in its own way. And he tested out a number of innovations of Antarctic transports. So they tried using cars. That didn't work very well. They also brought Manchurian ponies, and none of them survived the trip. The last of them fell down a crevasse. So the ponies didn't fare well, and they also didn't survive. And then Scott would actually try to adapt some of Shackleton's failed experiments during his own subsequent attempt to go to the South Pole. Overall, I think this trip and the later failure of Scott's efforts kind of indicates that A, you need specialized equipment in Antarctica, not just cars, and pack animals don't do well in Antarctica, at least ponies and horses. They managed okay with dog sleds, but even the dogs had a hard time, and they don't use dog sledding teams in Antarctica anymore. Anyhow, another thing I want to notice is that there was another member of the crew, Douglas Mawson, who would later actually show up as the leader of the Australasian Antarctica expedition, and he was part of the crew that summited Erebus. You'll see a lot of the names pop up. A lot of the people who led their own expeditions later on got their start working on other people's expeditions and getting the experience. That would be kind of like if I ever became a geology researcher and became like a tenured professor and led people to Antarctica. I'd be like, oh, I started out being the one led here. And some photos from Shackleton's expedition, this poor Manchurian pony, it's just strangely melancholy to me because those ponies just were basically put on a suicide mission. And it wasn't good for them. So I just find that kind of depressing. So Shackleton did not quite reach the South Pole. But subsequently, it would soon be reached during one of the more legendary tales of Antarctic heroism. And the race to the South Pole actually involved 2 separate trips that began during the same year. Now, Amundsen and Scott, the 2 men involved, do not seem to have had any personal animosity towards each other. But they were both, by this point, famous explorers, and Amundsen had been the first mate aboard the Belgian Antarctic expedition. He was Norwegian, and he was an experienced mountaineer who had also successfully traversed the Northwest Passage, going through the Canadian archipelago from Baffin Bay to Nome, Alaska, which is what I meant by saying when the Northwest Passage exists, but it's probably best left to experienced explorers. He began his Antarctic route on the eastern side of the Ross Ice Shelf near a site known as the Bay of Whales. And he indeed would become the first person to reach the pole. Scott was making his second attempt to reach the pole, and this time his trip was entirely geared towards that. He started on Ross Island and essentially followed Shackleton's route for much of his second attempt. He would reach the South Pole successfully, but would do so about a month after Amundsen and with his crew in much, much worse shape. And Amundsen and his men made it back safely, but not a single member of Scott's crew survived, at least the crew that went to the South Pole. His last surviving men died in March of 1912, well on the Ross Ice Shelf, really just miles from their relatively close to their return point, and also only a few miles from their main food depot, from where they had left food for them to eat. And that's what I mean when I say depot. A strategy was for the explorers to go along part of the way and leave food for themselves for later, or to have a party left behind do that for their return. So Scott didn't really bear Amundsen any personal animosity, but he did kind of feel like his thunder had been stolen. And this was because Amundsen had actually been more interested in reaching the North Pole, but he was beaten to it by an expedition led by Robert Peary, and the first person to reach the North Pole was actually an African-American man named Matthew Henson, who we'll talk about later. But he almost visited Antarctica as an afterthought, and Scott was a little bit bummed out about this. So like, what are you doing here? Like, isn't the North more your thing? But his strategy would turn out to be the more successful one. So ponies had not worked well. Amundsen decided to go with dogs. He was an experienced sled dog commander from his experience in the Arctic, and he viewed them as faster and more effective than ponies or cars. In his view, a faster and lighter trip was a safer trip, and that would largely turn out to be correct. So he actually planned to eat a number of the dogs as part of the food, which is a little bit gruesome but practical. 11 of the dogs would actually survive. They would accompany Amundsen when he got off the ship. So not all of the dogs died. 11 out of about 50 made it back to Australia. But the dogs served anyway. The dogs did a fantastic job. The dog sleds helped them get to the pole as fast as they did, and helped them save as much food as they did, and end up back at base alive and well. So only 3 men accompanied Amundsen to the pole to travel as light as possible, and a larger crew remained behind on the ship. Amundsen and his crew made a handful of trips along the planned route to leave food for themselves and to scout out. And on the return journey, the men left behind at the ship did the same thing for Amundsen and his men to pick up on the way back. And Amundsen came to Antarctica early. He used the winter to lighten the sleds as much as possible, to refine the packing list, to pack only the essentials and have as light a sledge as possible, and making new winter clothes. And with the dogs doing most of the manual labor, Amundsen and his men ended up making good time when they actually set out. They would arrive at the pole on December 14th, 1911, becoming the first people to visit the South Pole. And they established a camp that they called Polheim or Polhome, which I find rather adorable. They stayed for only 3 days because they really needed to get back and conserve food. They left behind a tent along with a small amount of extra food for Scott. This was to prove that they'd been there, and also to serve as relief for him, which he would need. And again, this is another instance which shows that they didn't seem to hate each other too much personally, which is good. But the fact was that Scott would need this shelter and this extra food. And I do really like how many more pictures we have from the heroic age. One thing that scientists find especially useful about, there's Amundsen with his dogs and the Norwegian flag, actually, which I think is cute. But one thing that scientists find useful with these pictures is they can see how glaciers have retreated. They can look at pictures of glaciers from the late 19th century and see how they've retreated to the present day with the effects of global warming. So Robert Falcon Scott would become the second person to lead an expedition to the North Pole, but he would die on his return trip. A lot of what is known from his trip is from his journal, which was recovered in good condition upon his death, along with a number of scientific samples and photographs. So Scott and his men didn't survive, but their documentation of the trip did, at least. He attempted an all of the above strategy. He tried to use ponies again, he used more cars that he'd modified, and he used dogs. He also planned essentially a caravan. He had ponies and sledges laden down with all of the supplies they would need, and he would periodically, he had this big amount of supplies for just basically any misfortune, which makes sense. You want to be prepared, but it slowed them down a lot. They did send people back. They sent people back with used supplies and extra weight as they went along, and only 5 people went to the pole. And A lot of the failings of Scott's trip don't really seem to have been really just related to Antarctica just being dangerous, period, because he did a lot of things that made sense. He laid supplies before. Remember that he actually would end up perishing less than 11 miles from a supply cache that had been left behind for him, which is extremely depressing. But the fact is, they ended up going much more slowly. They ended up going much more slowly than Amundsen, and they reached the pole on January 17th, a whole month after Amundsen had left. And so the tent and food that Amundsen had left did help, but they had a hard time on the trip home, and the men got really bad frostbite. They had to make the return journey mostly on foot. So one of the men, Edgar Evans, suffering from frostbite and head injuries, died on February 17th. And another man, Lawrence Oates, who is actually the namesake for Oates Land in Antarctica, was suffering from frostbite and appears to have wandered out into the ice to sacrifice himself, which is sad, especially because even with his sacrifice, the remaining 3 men likely would not have had much of a survival chance. So then Scott, Wilson, and Bowers continued onward, but they were also suffering from frostbite, and less than 11 miles from their main supply depot, they were halted by a blizzard. A horrible, horrible blizzard, the type that you would consider a whiteout today, where you just can't go outside because you'll get lost. And the final journal entry was on March 29th. So 9 days later, the blizzard was still going. And that is presumed to be the day that they died, because in his words, outside the door of the tent, it remains a scene of whirling drift. And they had no hope of moving forward. So Scott's trip ended in tragedy. And this played a role in the fact that the US base was eventually named after him as well. Amundsen Scott Base was named after the 2 men who made the race to the South Pole, and to honor the memory of Scott. And I believe that Amundsen played a role in revitalizing Scott's legacy and promoting him as a solid expedition leader, just one who ran into bad luck. The blizzard really does strike me as a combination of bad luck and also just people not having a full scope of how damn dangerous Antarctica could be. And we will return with more heroic age tales during the second half of the lecture.